Please join in. We're going to begin in just a moment. We're just going to allow a few more participants to join and we will get started. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Rahul Gupta, and I'm Senior Vice President, Chief Medical and Health Officer at Marsh & Dimes. We are happy to welcome you today. I'm so pleased to be here to moderate today's webinar. Thank you for joining the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics, as we call it, CAMT. And thank you for joining this virtual briefing on COVID-19 and the imperative to include pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. CAMT was launched in 2014 with the goal of better understanding the safety and efficacy of medications and vaccines used during pregnancy and breastfeeding. You can see the partners on your screen that belong to this coalition. This is necessary because each year, nearly 4 million people in the United States give birth and more than 3 million breastfeed their infants. And nearly all of these individuals will take a medication or receive a vaccine. However, very little is known about the effect of most drugs on a person's pregnancy or the ways in which pregnancy may alter the uptake, metabolism, and efficacy of medications. To promote the inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials, CAMT advocated for the creation of the Federal Task Force on Research Specific to Pregnant Women and Lactating Women, what it's called PREGLAC, P-R-G-L-A-C, to identify and address gaps in knowledge regarding the safe and effective therapies and vaccines for pregnant and lactating women. PREGLAC has released 2 reports with detailed recommendations and implementation strategies to promote the inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. The COVID-19 pandemic is a public health emergency that has put this issue in the spotlight. There have been numerous news stories about how pregnant and breastfeeding individuals were excluded from clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccine and therapeutics, despite recent data that has demonstrated that pregnant people are more likely to have severe COVID disease, including an increased risk of ICU admissions, mechanical ventilation, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation being an event, as well as death compared to non-pregnant people. This leaves pregnant and lactating persons and the clinicians who care for them to assess the risks and benefits of a particular COVID-19 therapeutic or whether they should receive a COVID vaccine. So I'm so glad today to have a very esteemed group of panelists join me talking about this issue, PREGLAC's work and how to increase inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in research in the context of COVID and beyond. Let me introduce our panelists to you. I'll provide a very brief introduction and you're welcome to go to those institutional websites to get full bios. First, we will hear from Dr. Diana Bianchi, who is the director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, or NICHD. Dr. Bianchi will be providing us an overview of PREGLAC's recommendations and implementation plan and provide highlights of NICHD activities to promote inclusion and advance clinical research. Then we will hear from Dr. Emily Miller, who is assistant professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Northwestern University. Dr. Miller will discuss her experiences treating patients during the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Jacqueline Parking, who is assistant professor of maternal-fetal medicine at McGovern Medical School at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, or UT Health. Dr. Parkham will offer both professional and personal insights as a physician and pregnant person who decided to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. We will have sufficient time for questions afterwards. Please don't hesitate to type those into the box as we begin our conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Bianchi. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. And I can go to the next slide. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you. And what I'm going to try to communicate in the next 15 minutes or so are 3 points, basically. Talking the talk and giving you the recommendations and our plans for implementation regarding the PregLac task force, which NIH led and NICHD essentially ran with multiple federal partners from industry, professional societies, and caregivers and individuals. Then I'm going to get to walking the walk, which is important because you can give a set of recommendations, but if you don't think a lot about how to actually implement them and put them into practice, then they're going to sit on a shelf somewhere. And then I did want to specifically mention, and this will, I hope, segue into some of the other talks, about the issue that pregnant and lactating people are truly interested in participating in research. So it's really good to ask them if they want to participate. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So really the PregLac task force goes back to the 21st Century Cures Act, which was the last act that President Obama signed on December 13th, 2016. And the task force was tasked with identifying and addressing gaps in knowledge and research regarding safe and effective therapies for pregnant women and lactating women, including the development of such therapies. The group met initially for 1.5 years. Next slide, please. And came up with a set of 15 recommendations that were submitted to then HHS Secretary Azar and members of Congress in September of 2018 on time. And the key recommendations including, very importantly, changing the existing culture that has limited scientific knowledge of therapeutic product safety, effectiveness, and dosing for pregnant and lactating women. We really wanted to recommend a change in culture that would protect women through research instead of from research. We also recommended removing pregnant women as a vulnerable population through the common rule and expanding the workforce of clinicians and researchers with expertise in obstetric and lactation pharmacology and therapeutics. We also recommended removing regulatory barriers. And all of the recommendations, the full task report, and indeed the implementation plan are all publicly available at this link. Next slide, please. Some of the early impact that PregLac had was even to be able to address what is happening in terms of research on pregnant and lactating women. NIH needed to create new reporting categories. It's amazing that 90% of women have at least one pregnancy in their lifetime, and yet the formal reporting categories that report annually on the amount of research dollars spent per category had never included pregnancy. So now we can say from 2017 onward, how much is the NIH spending on pregnancy-related research, maternal health research, breastfeeding, lactating, and breast milk. And we have a new one coming because of the concerns regarding maternal morbidity and mortality that is coming this year. So this allows anybody to publicly go to the link and see how much is NIH spending in Alzheimer's, for example, versus pregnancy-related research. In addition, through our PregSource, crowdsourcing research to determine what's happening in a typical pregnancy, we added a medication and supplement tracker to understand what are pregnant women taking as part of their therapies during their pregnancy. Next slide, please. So that was about the first year and a half, but we recognized that, again, that if we just had essentially a white paper, it wouldn't go anywhere. So the next year and a half was spent creating an implementation plan. And again, I want to thank all of our colleagues, our federal partners, the FDA, the CDC, the VA, et cetera, as well as partners from industry, partners from within NIH and the professional societies, as well as academicians. We created 4 working groups. These included research and training, regulatory, communication, and drug discovery. And the themes that emerged included leveraging or expanding existing federal programs or networks, developing new research tools and strategies, considering alternative trial designs, utilizing registries and usable data sources, establishing a prioritization process for studying therapeutics used during pregnancy and lactation, addressing ethical considerations, liability concerns, and potential research incentives to pursue the research. Importantly, we need to foster education and awareness among healthcare providers and pregnant and lactating women. And we also suggested which groups might be responsible for promoting or implementing these things. We were not suggesting that, for example, NIH would do all of these things. Next slide, please. Next slide. So at NICHD, the institute that I direct, we are walking the walk. And for a long time, we have been concerned that a lack of inclusion in research complicates decision-making overall for pregnant and lactating people. And we use the term people to be more inclusive. But we recently wrote this article, which is a viewpoint commentary that was published in JAMA, and again, is publicly available, because we felt that COVID-19 was really a great illustration of where the recommendations for PregLac could be included. And since they were not included because of the rapidity of the pandemic, we really want to create awareness of the recommendations for implementation of PregLac so that in the future, when the next pandemic occurs, we will be ready. And I think many people in this audience know, and Dr. Gupta already said, that pregnancy increases medical risks for pregnant women. And the evidence for utility, safety, and effectiveness of the available vaccines is largely unknown for pregnant women. And if we implement the PregLac recommendations, we could improve the situation faced by pregnant and lactating women, people. Next slide, please. So in our commentary, it's important, we made some suggestions, and we're grateful for the opportunity to share them with you. First of all, pregnant people are no longer considered as a vulnerable population. Pregnant people, when presented with evidence, can make decisions regarding informed consent to participate the same as non-pregnant people. It's not too early to begin preparing now for the next epidemic or pandemic. And what we suggested in our commentary is that if animal studies on pregnant model organisms and initial phase 1 safety data are reassuring, there should immediately be a plan made for inclusion of pregnant people. In the situation with COVID, only Moderna supplied animal model data on their EUA application. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of time that information was not even available at the time that pregnant people could have been included in these early trials. We recommended that the use of registries such as the CDC's VSafe. There is information now that is being collected on pregnant people. The NIH, for example, has existing research networks that can be repurposed to collect data or to use information on pregnant people, and we can share data and biospecimens. In addition, the liability risk to pharma can be mitigated by programs such as the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. And this program does not exclude pregnant people. It provides benefits to pregnant and non-pregnant people who are injured by products designed to treat or prevent public health threats. So whether this would have reassured the companies that are making the vaccines, I don't know, but I do want to acknowledge specifically that Pfizer is now doing a study that is specifically looking at the effects of the vaccine in pregnant people, and we are happy to hear that, and we are encouraging that. Next slide, please. Again, we're walking the walk at NICHD, so I just wanted to briefly say that we are very committed to safely testing drugs in pregnant people. So we are using one of our existing networks. We're doing exactly what we recommended should be done. We're using an existing network to conduct studies on the use of remdesivir in pregnant and non-pregnant people. And we're doing this because it's important to understand how the drug is metabolized in pregnant people and to identify any potential side effects. Women who receive the drug within 5 days of delivery, we will be collecting umbilical cord blood samples to analyze how remdesivir is metabolized in the placenta. And for women who are willing to participate, we'll be collecting breast milk to see if the remdesivir is in the breast milk. Next slide, please. And in addition, we are rolling out something called the Imprint Hub, which is a center of excellence that will function both as a service center and a catalyst for science. It's serving as a platform for innovative multidisciplinary research on drugs and devices in pregnancy and lactation. And the goal is eventually to develop a precision medicine approach to maternal and pediatric therapeutics. So this is a new initiative that is being rolled out by one of our branches in our extramural program. Next slide. So just a couple of slides to share with you that pregnant women are very interested in participating in research. We have, again, one of our networks, the Maternal-Fetal Medicine Units Networks, is present at 12 centers nationally with 39 individual hospital sites. And we have been recently analyzing the medical records of up to 24,000 plus pregnant women who've given birth at one of these clinical centers. And the goal of the study was to look at how COVID-19 has affected the entire birth experience with regard to symptoms of COVID-19 and outcomes for the baby as well as the mother. And what the study showed, it was recently presented at the Society for Maternal-Fetal Medicine meeting, was that women who had mild or moderate symptoms of COVID-19 did not have a higher risk for pregnancy complications, but the women with severe symptoms were at higher risk for cesarean section delivery, postpartum hemorrhage, hypertensive disorders, and preterm birth. But interestingly, we did have a press release about the study, and our communications division received multiple inquiries outside of the network to see if they could participate. Next slide. In addition, in a separate study, we've been evaluating SARS-CoV-2 in breast milk. The question is whether the virus is actually transmitted to an uninfected infant via breast milk, and it doesn't appear to be the case. And with proper hygiene, meaning washing the breast, good hand washing, it's safe to breastfeed. And interestingly, a study from investigators who are supported by NICHD and NIAID has shown that human milk contains antibodies directed against SARS-CoV-2, and these antibodies are different from those antibodies in blood. and might actually suggest the potential to use milk-derived antibodies for therapeutic use. But similar to the situation with the Gravitz study, we have been receiving multiple emails from women who are lactating and want to donate their milk for research. Next slide, please. So in summary, a continuing need exists to address gaps in knowledge and research related to the development of safe and effective therapies for pregnant and lactating people. I again encourage you to go to the publicly available PregLac recommendations and implementation plan, which provides a roadmap for the next pandemic. And I do believe we need to be planning now for the next pandemic. We wrote the commentary because we didn't want pregnant people and their clinicians to be in the difficult situation of making decisions without evidence. The professional societies suggest that you should discuss the situation with your care provider, but it's a bit unfair to ask your care provider to give recommendations if you don't have evidence. So the bottom line is, let's take advantage of the fact that pregnant and lactating people are very interested in participating in research. We suggest some ways that it can be safe to include pregnant people, and pregnant people are no longer a vulnerable population. So I thank you for the chance to share what we've done at NICT, and I look forward to the question period. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bianchi. And with that, we will certainly looking forward to questions. I will turn it over to Dr. Emily Miller, who will discuss her experiences in treating patients during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Miller.
Thank you. And let me know if you can please see my slides, okay? Is that working okay? Perfect. All right, thank you so much for having me. And Dr. Bianchi, what an inspirational talk to follow. Thank you so much for those words. What I want to do as a maternal fetal medicine physician on the ground is really paint the picture that she began on that canvas and talk about what it's like to be a maternal fetal medicine physician taking care of high-risk pregnant patients and where we are and where I think we need to be. And so I want to begin with this quote, and this is something that you have all seen before. Discuss with your doctor before taking. And when we think about this, right, we see this on television commercials all the time. We see this on the back of over-the-counter medications. And I think we all as individuals have the absolute full expectation that we could go to our doctor and we could ask about that medication. How does it work? How would it work for me? What might the side effects be? Would this be safe? And I think we should have that expectation. But I can tell you, as a practicing high-risk obstetrician, I can't always do that. And almost every single patient I see in the office is on a medication that there's insufficient data for me to counsel her on what the risks and benefits are. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about today, is where we are and where I think we need to go. The way that I want to do this is to begin with level setting. I think there's a lot of myths. Dr. Bianchi talked about a lot of them about medication use in pregnancy. So we'll level set there. We'll then talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has maybe amplified some of these concerns. And then I'll give just a few words about how I think we collectively can bridge the chasm. So the first thing there's 4 myths that I want to debunk, or 4 facts that I really want us all to come away from this knowing. And the first is that pregnancy is common. It shouldn't be something that's swept aside or as a rare population. We have 6 million pregnant Americans every year in the United States, 4 million of whom give birth. Over the next decade, that's 60 million pregnancies that will occur. And I would argue that it's not just that these pregnancies are common. These are our siblings, these are our cousins, these are our friends. And I would argue, admittedly biased as a maternal fetal medicine physician, that these are some of the most important people in our country because they are responsible for the next generation of Americans. So pregnancy is common, pregnant people are important. The next myth is that pregnant people don't take medications, and that's just not true. Pregnant people absolutely are taking medications. So this is a graph that kind of depicts, it's a little bit older data, but 2 points that I think it communicates pretty clearly. So if you look on the y-axis, you'll see the mean number of drugs on the left-hand side. And then on the x-axis, you can see the years. And the first point I want you to take from this is that as we progress from the 70s into the late 2000s, we see that pregnant women were taking more and more medications. It was more common. There's been changes in our demographics. There's been increased numbers of pregnant people that are pregnant later in their lives, that might have other comorbidities. And so medication use is increasingly common. The second point that I want to make is if you look at that purple line on the top with the purple diamonds, if you go all the way to the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that the average number of medications that are being taken during the course of an average American pregnancy is more than 4, perhaps even higher now. And so I really want to make this point that it is not a rarity for pregnant people to be taking medications. It's incredibly common. The data from the CDC tell us that there's 5.4 million pregnant individuals that are exposed to medications every year in the United States. So pregnancy is common. Using medications in pregnancy is common, but pregnancy is complex. I think it's really important, and Dr. Bianchi mentioned this, pregnant people are not vulnerable. In fact, I would argue they're the furthest thing from it. When we think about what they are charged to do, to gestate an entire human being and to raise it with, I would argue, very minimal social and societal support, they're the furthest thing from vulnerable. I think these are superheroes, but they're really medically complex. And I'll give you 2 reasons that I think they are. The first, when we think about the maternal side of things, is that the metabolism in pregnancy changes. And so a medication that given to a non-pregnant person might be fine could be broken down more quickly during pregnancy. And what that means is that its efficacy, how well that same medication works, may not apply in the context of a pregnancy. It may not work as well. And the converse of that could also be true. Perhaps a medication is broken down into toxic metabolites that could cause harm, that if studied in a non-pregnant person, we wouldn't identify this. But once we're able to distill the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, kind of how stuff works in pregnancy, we might identify harms that aren't otherwise known. The second piece of this equation is the fetus. We know that some medications, not all, cross the placenta, and some medications, certainly not all, can cause harm. They could cause pregnancy loss or birth defects or prematurity or developmental disabilities or even infant death. And so it's really important that we recognize that pregnant people are not vulnerable, but they are medically complex and they deserve rigorous scientific attention. The final point that I want to make is that despite all of the things I've told you, that pregnancy is common, that pregnant people take medications, that pregnant people are medically complex and need attention, we have enormous gaps in the amount of data that's available. In the US right now, only about 2% of medications have studies to inform drug dosing, and only 2% of medications have data to inform pregnancy-specific risks. This is an enormous problem, and it makes it really challenging to be a high-risk obstetrician. So that's the backdrop. And now we've been entering into a pandemic. And so how does the pandemic interface with these dynamics? And I want to tell you kind of 2 points. One, we'll talk about the vaccine, and then I want to kind of tell a story about therapeutics and where we are in pregnancy. When we think about the vaccine, I think all of us are very familiar with the phases, phase 1A, 1B, 1C, and who's included in each of those phases. And when we think about them, I put purple boxes around people within those phases that may include pregnant individuals. And so when we went through phase 1A, it's estimated that there are 330,000 pregnant people in the US that are healthcare workers over the course of the pandemic. That's a really high number. As we've pivoted to phase 1B, I can't find any estimates, but one would have to imagine it's multiplicative, right? That's a huge number of people that are frontline essential workers, teachers, drivers, grocery store workers, right? That's going to include a lot of reproductive age women. And now as we're entering into 1C, we're including persons with high-risk medical conditions, and that absolutely includes pregnancy because of all of the risks that Dr. Gupta mentioned, right? Increased risks of severe morbidity and mortality associated with being pregnant. And so now we're talking about administering the vaccine to 6 million people each year. These are not small numbers. And these are the groups of people that are coming into my office and they're asking me, Dr. Miller, should I take the vaccine? Is it safe? And here's what I can tell them. I can tell them that in the EUAs, there are published DART studies. These are reproductive toxicity studies. They gave us animal data from rats that said that when we gave this vaccine in equivalent doses to rats, we didn't see any signals of harm. And that's reassuring, certainly not enough. I can also tell them that in the trials that we have data from, the Pfizer trial and the Moderna trial, that 12 people in the Pfizer trial were randomized to the vaccine and became pregnant, and 6 people in the Moderna trial were randomized to the vaccine and became pregnant. And those 18 people seem to be doing okay, and their pregnancies seem to be okay, but that's certainly insufficient. We have no clinical trials that have included pregnant individuals, and we don't have any published observational data on the safety or efficacy of this vaccine. And so you can imagine being in the office trying to communicate that this is a potential life-saving vaccine. This has huge benefits, but there is still ongoing uncertainty. I'll then pivot to therapeutics. I think one of the things we can all celebrate is this huge success of the NIH, of the medical community, of scientists that have really gathered together to generate some amazing evidence. For non-pregnant individuals, we have level 1 evidence that's randomized trials without major limitations on medications for prevention as well as for treatment of severe COVID-19. That's amazing for a virus that we didn't even know existed a year ago. I think that's something to really celebrate. But when we think about pregnancy and pregnant individuals, that data isn't level 1. It's not randomized trials. What we have is expert opinion. And expert opinion is great because we have a lot of really smart physicians and scientists in the field of obstetrics, but it certainly has its limitations. And so I'll tell you a story about one medication, dexamethasone, where I think this limitation has caused harm. So in July of 2020, some researchers had finally published the results of their randomized trial looking at dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is a high potency steroid. It's a steroid that we think that when folks are sick with COVID-19 pneumonia, can calm down the inflammation inside their lungs and allow it to heal, allow them to breathe more easy. And they found this group, when they randomized people, 6,000 people, to either dexamethasone or placebo, that dexamethasone, when given to hospitalized patients with COVID-19, saved lives. This was incredible. This was the data we were all waiting for. We wanted to know how we can care for these people that were in our hospitals. The challenge is dexamethasone is a steroid that crosses the placenta. And fears were raised that if this crosses the placenta, we know from studies, not in COVID, but in prematurity, that it can cause injury to the brain if given in repeated and high doses. And so a lot of really fantastic, smart, educated physicians, scientists, experts in our field wrote a commentary. And they said, you know, gosh, this is a really great medication. It makes a lot of sense, but this could be harmful in pregnancy. And so maybe we should give a different steroid in pregnancy, something called methylprednisolone. Same concept, it's a steroid, so it calms down inflammation, but methylprednisolone doesn't cross the placenta. That seemed like a fantastic idea. A few months later, a randomized trial was published that showed that methylprednisolone actually isn't beneficial. Compared to placebo, there were no benefits and no reductions in mortality. And so I tell you the story to really say that if we're left with expert opinion, a lot of times we get it right, but sometimes we get it wrong. And this isn't just, we want to say level 1 on a pretty table. This is people's lives that are left in limbo because we don't have the data to make sure that we are taking effective care of them. And so I've painted a picture of a pretty big chasm, right? There's a huge gap from where we are and where we need to be able to take care of pregnant individuals. And while that might seem insurmountable, I do think, and Dr. Bianchi, I think, painted a really important picture of the bridge. And I do think that clinical research and the ethical conduction of clinical research that includes intentionally pregnant individuals is going to allow us to bridge this gap, but it will take a collaboration and a concerted effort. But I hope that by being all here today and beginning this conversation, we're one step closer to when a patient comes to my office and says she has seen an ad that says discuss with her doctor before taking that I can actually discuss with her what medications to use. So thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. And what an insight from the ability to have policy changes in terms of PregLac and the multidisciplinary and partnership work to actual real life experience. So of having to make those tough decisions on the ground. With that, we'll move to Dr. Parkin, who will offer both professional and personal insights as a physician and a pregnant person who decided to receive the COVID vaccine. And please continue to give us, provide us questions. We look forward to answering your questions as well. Dr. Parkin.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I want you all to imagine for a moment that you're a new mom and you've decided that you're going to get the COVID-19 vaccine to protect yourself and your family, and you're also a frontline healthcare worker. And so you've reviewed all the data, you've spent time considering your options, you've talked with your doctor, and you've decided to go for it. And you arrive for your appointment, and you sit down to get the shot, and you are denied. This happened to a mother in Illinois who said, "I actually burst into tears. I felt this internalized sense of shame and judgment that a county board felt that I couldn't make this decision and they would make it for me." This story and the struggles of so many other people trying to make this decision for themselves really moved me personally as a high-risk obstetrician and a scientist, but also as a mother who was pregnant with my third child when I was faced with making this tough decision for myself. And so today I'm going to share with you some of the challenges facing pregnant and lactating people when we have to make these decisions without data. And if there's one message I hope that you'll take away from today that you've been hearing over and over again is that we should really be protecting pregnant and lactating people through research, not from research. So how did we get to this point where a mother and a healthcare worker was denied the vaccine? This is just an overview of the drug and vaccine development process. And what you can see is to get from discovery to clinical use, we really rely on animal and human trials to provide the critical safety and efficacy data that we need to get approval for these therapeutics, in this case, the vaccine. And this process was, of course, accelerated at a record speed because of the emergent nature of the pandemic. But because pregnant and lactating people were intentionally excluded from the trials, we're operating really in a data-free zone. So OB patients and professionals really feel uncomfortable and confused about what to do without these data. And this confusion really began soon after the FDA issued its EUA for the Pfizer vaccine in early December, and professional organizations started releasing their expert opinions and guidelines. And so the CDC and many of the women's health organizations stated that COVID-19 vaccine should not be withheld from pregnant individuals who choose to receive the vaccine. Meanwhile, other organizations, including the Royal College in the UK and the World Health Organization, used different wording, saying until more data are available, vaccination during pregnancy is not recommended unless at risk. And I hope that you can appreciate that although neither of these statements is strongly recommending the vaccine because there were no data to support a strong recommendation, the tone and the wording is really different and has a different connotation. And so this created a lot of mixed messaging, and I'm highlighting here just a handful of the dozens of headlines about this issue. People were really confused, and it affected pregnant healthcare workers, pregnant and lactating healthcare workers first, because they were the first ones who were eligible for the vaccine. They were the ones on the front lines seeing the impact that the disease was having on our patients and our populations. And they were also the ones who were probably the most anxious to step up and get the vaccine because we were all really tired of being scared of getting exposed and bringing coronavirus home to our families. And many of us, actually probably everyone on this panel and most OB doctors and pediatricians and others, started getting inundated with texts and emails and direct messages from colleagues and family and even strangers, just with questions, people seeking some, advice, desperately seeking advice, wanting validation for their decisions, et cetera. And I'm just going to share some with you here. Will my baby be okay if I get the vaccine? I'm pregnant and I'm getting the vaccine. I'm so scared. Is it true that the vaccine causes infertility? Should I wait until I have the baby to get the vaccine? Will it be safe to breastfeed? And I'm desperate for the vaccine, but it won't be allowed. It's madness. And as if this decision-making weren't challenging enough, we all know that we're living in an era where we're inundated constantly with information, some of it good, some of it bad. It can be really hard to distinguish fact from fiction. And the data void that we have really creates space for this misinformation and fear-mongering. And so, I think many of us are concerned that the result of all of this misinformation will be that women in general are overestimating the risks of the vaccine and underestimating the benefits. So what's our approach now? You've heard a little bit earlier from Drs. Bianchi and Miller that we engage in a shared decision-making process in which we recognize that patients are the experts in their own lives and they bring their values and preferences to the table, while healthcare professionals are the experts in the science and in pregnancy, and we bring information and recommendations. But of course, this is challenging for us as OB professionals as well, because we are struggling to make recommendations in the absence of data. But we're fundamentally operating on the principle that pregnant women are autonomous and capable of making decisions about their health. I wanted to share this, which I think is the most common reason that people cite to defer vaccination, which is why put your baby in danger? Why not wait just to be safe? But inherent in this question is the assumption that waiting doesn't carry its own risk, when in fact, we know that we also need to consider the risk of not getting vaccinated. And so as you heard earlier from all of the panelists, pregnant people get sick just like everybody else. And in fact, pregnancy may increase the risk for some of the more severe complications of COVID-19. And as Dr. Judette Lewis recently pointed out, we won't offer a vaccine for fear that it may cross the placenta or fear that it may harm the baby. Well, I've got news for you, maternal death crosses the placenta. So here she's acknowledging what all of us high-risk obstetricians are always thinking about, which is that when mom doesn't do well, the babies don't do well either. And so indeed, not getting vaccinated may also be putting the baby at risk because the mom's health is at risk. And so many of us, the pregnant and lactating frontline healthcare workers who became eligible for the vaccine as soon as it came out, weighed those risks and benefits and decided to go for it and shared our experiences on social media. There's just a handful of dozens of people that have shared on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook with the hopes of encouraging others to trust the science and to consider getting vaccinated. Because we really know that when people are faced with a tough decision and they don't have data or strong recommendations, they look to see what other people are doing, someone they know or someone they trust. And so we hope that by sharing, we've been able to boost confidence in the vaccine. And in fact, earlier this month, Dr. Fauci announced that approximately 20,000 pregnant women have been vaccinated and there haven't been any red flags. So that is great news. Some of us, I'm pretty sure all of us actually got some criticism for posting about our decision to get the vaccine. But I would say that the positive comments outweighed or were much more prevalent than the negative ones. So I just wanted to share one with you here that I received from a stranger. I'm currently pregnant after going through a miscarriage with my first, but because of all the amazingly smart, incredible and strong pregnant doctors getting vaccinated, I feel much better and confident in my decision to go through with the vaccine. And I think this just shows how much influence we can have by sharing our voices and our experiences. So these are my take-home messages. We cannot exclude pregnant and lactating people from research and then use the lack of data to deny them protection from a potentially life-threatening illness. Pregnant individuals are medically complex, they're not vulnerable, and perfectly capable of making informed decisions on their own and deserve the same evidence to make informed decisions for themselves. And we should protect pregnant and lactating people through research, not from research. That's all I have. Looking forward to the question and answer session. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Parkin. We are looking forward to, again, 3 excellent presentations. If folks have questions, this is the time. I'll start with the first questions that's been submitted to us. It's from Neeraj Chavan. It says, pregnant women should not be deemed a vulnerable population. Such a powerful and thoughtful quote, and truly appreciated. Question is, how do we change the culture that revolves around this at academic, clinical, administrative, and more importantly, societal and community levels? I'll leave it to my panelists. We have some time, so go ahead if you all want to just give your thoughts.
So I think there may be some generational differences, and all efforts are good. So my 2 colleagues on the panel are influencers through social media, and I think that's extremely important, as is typical medical publications, as is educational sessions. Again, we were quite public about PregLac, and we have been publicizing it through NICHD's website, through every advisory council meeting, but I recognize that that wasn't enough. I do want to commend efforts, for example, on the part of the FDA, who recently held a workshop on PregLac and next steps. It really takes a village, and everyone needs to promote this concept in the environments in which they work. But I was quite gratified that the commentary, we got a lot of interest and very good altmetric scores, and that was seen by a number of people. But I think there is a groundswell of interest in this area, and I think in this sense, COVID has made it very clear that this is where the rubber meets the road. And if you don't prepare for this kind of situation, then you're going to put pregnant people and their caretakers in this very, very difficult situation that's been articulated by our 2 maternal-fetal medicine physicians here, who are trying to give data based on no evidence. I hand it over to my colleagues.
I think that, that's a great answer. And I think to me, this reflects the importance of having maternal fetal medicine specialists in broad venues. I think we're common in inner city hospitals and academic settings. And I think it's, I worry about places that don't have as ready access. And so thinking about distribution of the clinical workforce to make sure that when folks have questions about a medication in pregnancy, they have an availability of, even if we don't have data now, an expert opinion, as opposed to the often assumption of just don't give any medication or don't treat at all.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I think we have to find ways to reach people in non-academic settings, what Dr. Miller said. A lot of it has to do with we need to actively combat the misinformation. So when we're not sort of there to provide some facts and some data, the quickness with which those myths and rumors sort of swirl and become really toxic and negative is really hard to shake. Even as someone who felt really confident in my decision, it just starts to insert doubt into your mind when you see so many people agreeing and liking all of these things you're like, wait, do I really get that? But of course you do. But there are lots of smart people also saying these crazy things. And so I think we need to be there to sort of actively combat all of that stuff on every front, in the journals and when we speak publicly, but also in places where maybe we aren't as much, like Facebook chat groups and things like that.
But I would say that we can't ignore academic medical centers either. I think there is a between specialty difference. I mean, my entire career until 4 years ago was in academics, and you know, things that we would commonly accept in pediatrics and OBGYN were not what other specialists were communicating to the patient. So I think even in academics, there's an important role for promoting this and spreading the word that pregnant people are not considered to be a vulnerable population anymore.
Well, we do have a question, and I'm going to ask this the questions piece here. So from Catherine Connor, who talks about pushing clinical trials for certain populations that have been mandatory regulatory steps as well as permissive. For example, PREA, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, has been a major driver in getting data and ultimately FDA labeling for youngest age groups. So when it comes to pregnant and lactating people, do we think that removing barriers to enrolling pregnant people in clinical trials is enough to drive change, or do we need to have requirements such as?
I can just say something briefly, but I don't want to do all the talking. This is something that was definitely considered in the PregLac discussions. And the hope is that we will use the pediatric model through both PREA and the Best Pharmaceuticals in Children's Act to specifically label drugs for children, that we can use those models as a way to, again, extend the roadmap for pregnant people.
Yeah, I don't want to be cynical, but I think without regulatory teeth behind it, I think it's hard. Pregnant people are medically complex. They add cost, they add nuance to the informed consent process. You know, the monitoring is different. You need an obstetrician on your team to be able to assess adverse pregnancy outcomes and whether they're, you know, biologically potentially related to the intervention. And so I think in the absence of a requirement, I think it's going to be hard for it to become as widespread as I think we need it to be.
Wonderful. There's another question that talks about, with over 70% of healthcare professionals female and of reproductive age, why are pharmaceutical companies not urged to provide more data on the products? So that's a question that I think from a practitioner standpoint might be important to address or think about.
I agree with this sentiment.
So I will, I'm gonna back and forth. We have some questions in chat and some in Q&A. So are there any recommendations or indications for increased surveillance of pregnant people who get the vaccine during pregnancy? I'm imagining we're talking about COVID-19 vaccine. And we talked about the V-Safe a bit, Dr. Bianchi.
Maybe I can just briefly explain V-Safe and then ask Drs. Parkham and Miller to amplify. But V-Safe is a registry. It's not exclusively for pregnant women. It was created by the CDC. I took a look at it. It's very pictorial in nature. It's very user-friendly. It's done on a smartphone. It's really checking in with people on a regular basis to see what kind of reactions they've had, any adverse effects. There is one question about whether they're pregnant or not, so they'll be able to pull out the data specifically on pregnant women.
Yeah, and I was impressed with V-Safe, both the user friendliness of the application. It only takes a couple minutes to fill out your questionnaires, but also because I received a call from the CDC I think 5 or 6 weeks after my first dose, saying, hey, you indicated that you were pregnant. Can we ask you a bunch of questions? And we had about a 15-minute chat about my medical history, extensive obstetric and medical history taking, and also they asked for permission to request my medical records and who my doctor was and all of those things. So I think that there's a pretty good effort, grassroots effort from the CDC to try to reach out to these 20,000 people who've been vaccinated and really look into what's happening to them. And they indicated that there would be follow-up after I had the baby to ask me about my pregnancy outcomes as well. So I was really reassured by that.
And I'll just build on routine clinical practice in case that was the root of the question. I think at this point, again, I know I've said some things about expert opinion that weren't great, and we need data so that we aren't necessarily wrong. But gosh, it's hard for me to imagine that there's true biologic plausibility that this vaccine could truly cause fetal harm. And I think that's an important message that we don't want to lose sight of. And so in terms of routine, someone that gets the vaccine, I don't recommend anything different about their surveillance. They get the same, diligent maternal fetal medicine care or routine obstetric care that they were otherwise getting. I think it is hard to imagine that this would divert any of the kind of normal processes that would happen.
So the next question is from Norbert McCory. Are you aware of any teratology studies in pregnant animals in any one of the currently available COVID-19 vaccines? So we talked about the DART studies a little bit, so if anyone wants to comment on that as well.
I could talk a little bit about just what's available, and it's in the inserts of the EUA, where they describe rat studies that examined vaccine at equivalent doses that were given pre-conception as well as during gestation, and there haven't been any safety signals toward any reproductive toxicity. So that means fertility issues, miscarriage, developmental problems, early delivery, anything along those lines. So it's been really reassuring.
Wonderful. And there's a question about, would you still recommend human antibodies be tested in pregnant rats better than nothing? Anyway, virus antigen not expressed in eukaryotes anyways. So don't really understand if you want to restate that question. So we were happy to. The next question is about, to what degree is the liability issue as a component of not conducting these studies? And of course, there's a very healthy discussion during PregLac subgroup meetings about that. So if we'd love to hear your comments about that.
Well, of course, there are concerns, and that is one of the reasons why we had representatives from industry who were incredibly thoughtful, and they gave us a reality check as to what various companies are thinking. But that's, in my mind, that there has to be a mitigation strategy, and this vaccine compensation program or injury compensation program that's a government initiative might be able to mitigate the risk. I think because of the history of thalidomide, there is a tremendous amount of caution and concern, but that was 60 years ago. So isn't it time to take a new look at things, particularly in this scenario where we're talking about the risk of death or severe illness versus the vaccine.
I know we're at time. I'll take one more question. Of course, there's a question about the pharma providing data, and this is really data safety monitoring boards that get that done with. The question here is about any merit to waiting until after the first trimester, and that's probably speaking about the COVID vaccine.
This is another common question that we get, and I think just in general, not thinking about the vaccine, but in general, I think a lot of women are concerned about the first trimester because miscarriage, we know, is very common. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women have an early pregnancy loss. And their natural inclination is to go back in time and say, what did I do? What medication did I take? What exercise did I do? What did I eat that could have caused this? When in fact, we know that they had no control and that it's a natural process that was going to happen anyway. And so, often when we make recommendations about, if you're worried about that, just avoid it in the first trimester, it's because that's when a lot of the major organ development is happening, and miscarriage is very common. And so just to kind of put that worry out of people's minds, even though the thing that they did or took is not related to the outcome, if that makes any sense. In terms of the vaccine, some people have raised concern because one of the side effects, of course, is fever. And fever has been linked in observational studies to some birth defects. But I would challenge people to think about the differences with fever associated with infection and moms being really sick, and a transient fever that we know we can treat with Tylenol due to a common vaccine side effect, and also the usual challenges with observational data, which have all kinds of biases. I guess I didn't really answer the question, but it depends on how worried you are about those things happening and how much guilt you would feel and how much you would attribute that to the vaccine.
And I think it also depends on your exposure. So I got a question, and I'm not an OBGYN, but I've done a lot of work in the area. But somebody asked a question about a pulmonologist who's doing a lot of bronchoscopies on patients who might have COVID. Now, there's someone who, is directly being exposed potentially to fluids that have virus in it. And so that person is in a different risk category than someone who is working at home, who has limited exposure, perhaps doesn't have any other children, and is isolating. So I think you have to put that into the equation as well.
Well, what a great discussion. In the hour, I think we provided more information than one can get from other sources. I want to really thank our panelists, Dr. Bianchi, Dr. Miller, and Dr. Parkham. And please read that viewpoint from JAMA. I read it. It's fascinating. It's a must read. So thank you to all of you for being so gracious with your time. I also want to thank Becky Abbott from SMFM, Johanna Gray, Izzy Karen with Artemis, and KJ Hurst from March of Dimes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us, and thanks to the sponsors.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And of course, you can go back and we will have a recording of this, and we will make that available as well as the slides. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Well, bye now.